Targaryen naming conventions is a surprisingly deep topic when you take the time to consider why some names are more popular than others. Of course, we have the obvious standout names, such as Aegon, which gets used repeatedly near on every generation. But there are some huge Targaryen names that are seemingly rare or never get used for reasons that are not entirely clear. That is until you dig a little deeper, where you find out there's often some reason or logic as to why certain names are neither never used or simply fell out of fashion. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at some of these least common Targaryen names and trying to figure out why these names became so underused. We will also be looking at some of the more popular Targaryen names and analysing real-world history to find out just why these names stuck around for generations. Now, something I want to briefly touch on is how different names were used prior to Aegon's conquest, because there is a stark before and after. Something we must remember is while pre-conquest history between the Doom and the Conquest is documented, we do still have large gaps when it comes to the extended Targaryen family. It is possible there are other Targaryens not on the current version of the family tree we simply do not know about yet. Now, when you look at pre-conquest Targaryens, there are a few names that do jump out, given they were used repeatedly over the years. The likes of Aegon, Aerion, Aerys, Baelon, Daemon, Alysanne. But it does beg the question as to why some pre-conquest names like Axel, Daemon, Maegor were never used again. But the ones that really do have me scratching my head, given their role in the rise of House Targaryen, is why no Targaryen was ever named after Aenar the Exile or Daenys the Dreamer. It was Daenys' dream of the Doom that instigated Aenar moving House Targaryen to Dragonstone, a move many thought he was mad for at the time. Without them, there would be no House Targaryen, so it really does seem strange that there was never another Aenar. When it comes to the names of the three heads of the dragon who conquered Westeros, it becomes obvious why more Targaryens would be named after them. Or does it? As on paper, only one of Aegon, Visenya and Rhaenys truly became popular in terms of naming. In total, there have been 5 kings named Aegon, but 9 Aegons in total, 3 of which were supposed to be the heirs to their father. We have Aegon the Uncrowned, the heir and eldest son of King Aenys, who was killed by his uncle Maegor when he usurped the crown. King Jaehaerys the Conciliator's firstborn son, Aegon, died as a babe. Prince Rhaegar's son and heir, Aegon, again, was killed during the sack of King's Landing. And finally, Prince Baelon, the father of King Viserys and Prince Daemon, had a third son named Aegon who died shortly after birth. Aegon becomes such a hugely popular name due to the sheer impact of Aegon the Conqueror himself. Calling a son Aegon isn't just a tribute to the man who built the dynasty, but is supposed to give an image of the kind of man you want your son to be. For example, King Viserys I and Queen Alysanne Hightower naming their first son Aegon had a very specific intent behind it. We see this commonly in real-world history, so it makes sense that George R.R. Martin would want to mirror this phenomenon somewhat. If we look at English kings post-Norman conquest, there is a reason why names like Henry and William become so popular. Take Henry for example. It shows both sides of this story. It becomes such a popular name thanks to some of these successful and in some cases legendary English kings called Henry. But after Henry VIII, the name suddenly stops being fashionable. There's not a single reason for this, but the fact Henry VIII became such a divisive and infamous figure, the name Henry kind of lost its prestige as a result. We can apply the same logic to some of the underused names in House Targaryen. There has only ever been 2 Maegor Targaryens and 1 Aenys Targaryen. I think the underuse of both of these names has a very clear reason. Both the sons of Aegon the Conqueror were questionable kings. King Aenys, while a kind-hearted man who just wanted to keep everyone happy, was a fairly poor king. He was famously indecisive, and his decision paralysis and general poor choices when it came to the marriages of his children led to the faith militant uprising, which again thanks to his indecision quickly grew out of control. It's not surprising why few Targaryens would want to name their son Aenys. Maegor as well is a fairly obvious reason. While he did usurp the throne, you cannot deny he did a good job at dealing with the Faith Uprising and establishing control back over Westeros. I do believe without Maegor, House Targaryen certainly would have fallen, and the dynasty would have died with Aenys, or under Aegon the Uncrowned. But Maegor's actions, once he was established firmly as king, cannot be overlooked when coming to his reputation. You don't get called Maegor the Cruel for no reason. Thus why it makes sense the name Maegor never gained popularity. There was one other Maegor Targaryen hundreds of years later. Even at the time, the naming of the child was seen as controversial and an ill omen. But again, the father of this Prince Maegor was Aerion Targaryen, a man remembered for his cruelty and his madness. Aerion naming his son Maegor very much fits his character. On paper, the names Rhaenys and Visenya should be as popular as Aegon the Conqueror, given their role in the conquest. But the names are used much less than Aegon. Taking Rhaenys as an example. After the original Rhaenys, there is only two other Targaryens whom were given that name. Rhaenys, the queen who never was, during the era of the Dance of the Dragons, and Rhaegar Targaryen's young daughter, Princess Rhaenys, killed during the sack of King's Landing. So given the importance of Rhaenys, the name only being used twice seems a bit odd. Or does it? Rhaenys is a perfect example of other names referencing Rhaenys without directly using her name. For example, Aegon and Rhaenys' eldest son, King Aenys, named his firstborn child Rhaena. Rhaena isn't the same name as Rhaenys, I hear you say. In Fire and Blood, it's specifically stated that Aenys chose Rhaena as a tribute to his late mother. So in canon, we know the name Rhaena is connected directly to Rhaenys. Thus, we have Aenys' daughter, Rhaena, and later Prince Daemon and Laena Velaryon's daughter, Rhaena. Interestingly, this particular Rhaena might be in reference to Laena Velaryon's mother, Rhaenys the Queen Who Never Was, rather than the Rhaenys of the Conquest. The question here is, does this mean all the Rhae-based names are a reference to Rhaenys? We know that Aenys' daughter, Rhaena, named her own daughter Rhaella. Thus, this too could be a Rhaenys reference. We can also assume the name Rhae is also connected to Rhaenys. By all this logic, I guess you could even argue that Rhaenyra is also a version of Rhaenys. So while on paper Rhaenys has only been used 3 times, if you include all the variations of it, it's more like 12. The same can be said for Visenya, but it's a bit more ambiguous. Historically, there's only ever been one other Visenya Targaryen, the stillborn daughter of Rhaenyra and Daemon Targaryen, but some fans have put an argument forward that the name Viserys is actually the male denomination of the name Visenya. Other than sounding similar, is there any proof that this could actually be the case? Well, this all centres around the argument that when King Aenys was naming his first 3 children, he did so in tribute to his parents, Aegon and Rhaenys, and his aunt, Visenya, the 3 conquerors. His first daughter was named Rhaena after his mother, his first son, Aegon, after his father, and his third child, another son, was named after Visenya. But being male, the male version of the name was used, thus Viserys. If this is indeed the case, we have several Viseryses over history. Aenys' son Viserys, King Viserys I and II, King Aerys II, the Mad King's son, Prince Viserys, or as some would say, King Viserys III. But this idea of Viserys being the male denomination of Visenya is, while being a very logical theory, it is just that. King Jaehaerys the Conciliator also had a daughter named Visera, but we cannot really say if that was meant to be a reference to Visenya. If you do include the idea of Visera and Viserys, Visenya and Visenya adjacent names have been used 6 times in House Targaryen. 7 if you want to include Viserys Plum, the bastard son of Aelena Targaryen. One running idea is, given Visenya's role in her son Maegor's rise to power, and thus her connection to his actions, like the name Maegor itself, it may have been seen as poor taste to name a child Visenya. Oddly, there are a few iconic Targaryen names that might not actually be Targaryen at all, but rather Velaryon. So, still Valyrian in nature, but coming from a very different house. I first stumbled upon this when I questioned, given how legendary Good Queen Alysanne became, the fact she's remembered as the Good Queen. It seems very off. There was never any more Targaryens named after her, and that's when I realised there are no other Targaryen Alysannes, because it might not actually be a Targaryen name at all. We've established it is common for both men and women to give their children names similar to their own as tribute. This seems to be the case with Alysanne. Her mother is Queen Alyssa Velaryon, so it's not unlikely the name Alysanne derives from her mother. Alysanne also named one of her own daughters Alyssa as well, which may support this connection somewhat. Now, when you look at the historical members of House Velaryon, the Al part of the name does seem to reoccur at the start or middle of some names, such as Alan or Alara. We also have the Sa part of Alysanne or Alyssa as a very common ending to names, with Velaryons such as Larissa. So perhaps the reason Alysanne has not been used more is because it's just not a Targaryen origin name. Oddly, however, after Alysanne's death, there are many non-Targaryen Alysannes that pop up, such as Alysanne Blackwood, Alysanne Hightower, Alysanne of Tarth. In fact, there is a total of 10 Alysannes since her death. Given King Jaehaerys the Conciliator is held up as one of the greatest kings Westeros has ever seen, up there with the very likes of Aegon the Conqueror himself, it does seem very strange the name did not become as popular as Aegon. Again, I think there could be two clear reasons for this. Naming children Aegon did become an established tradition within House Targaryen very quickly. The issue with Jaehaerys is the name soured somewhat too soon after his reign for it really to have become commonplace. After the Conciliator, King Aegon II named his twin children Jaehaerys and Jaehaera in tribute to the Conciliator. From Aegon II's point of view when naming the children, he was his father's heir, and Jaehaerys would in theory one day be king. But as we know, the Dance of the Dragons is a thing, and the succession of King Viserys was never going to be simple. The reason the name soured somewhat is not because someone named Jaehaerys did anything bad, because of the frankly horrific fate of both Jaehaerys and Jaehaera. Jaehaerys brutally murdered by blood and cheese during the early stages of the dance, as retaliation for the death of Lucerys Velaryon, and of course Jaehaera too meets her own awful fate in the years after the war, so you can kind of understand why the appeal of the name lost its shine. It's not until King Jaehaerys II, near on a century later, the name Jaehaerys was used again. But it must be noted that his father was King Aegon V, who was a big admirer of the Conciliator, hence why it makes sense he would choose this name again after so many years. There is also another way you can look at this. Maybe, given how hero-worshipped Jaehaerys became, to avoid unrealistic and unfair comparisons to him, Targaryens avoided the name. Like Alysanne, there is also the slim chance Jaehaerys could not be a traditional Targaryen name, given there is nothing else like it before the Conciliator. We had the likes of Jaehaerys Velaryon, which was chosen by Rhaenyra Targaryen and Laenor Velaryon's son because it is apparently a traditional Velaryon name, which suggests it's been used many times before. One thing I think is worth pointing out is Jaehaerys and Alysanne are the two youngest children of Queen Alyssa Velaryon. No one knew when they were born they would one day become king and queen. They had 3 elder siblings, each of which had Targaryen-sounding names. It would make sense if Alyssa was allowed to give her youngest 2 children Velaryon names under the circumstances, kind of similar to how Laenor Velaryon was allowed to name his 3rd son Joffrey, a non-traditional Velaryon name. I think the Dance of the Dragons really played a huge part in why certain names did and did not become popular during the second half of the Targaryen rule of Westeros. It makes sense why names such as Rhaenyra would be avoided. No matter what side of the conflict you were on, the name regardless is going to now have this very negative connection to it. While some argue that Aemond is a variation of the name Aemon, which given how close it is does make sense, we never again see another Aemond Targaryen, very much thanks to his actions during the war. Yet Aemon is still a very popular Targaryen name, used many times in the decades after. Helena is another very different Targaryen name that we had never seen before, which again just disappears thanks to the dark cloud looming over it, very much of the same ilk as Jaehaerys and Jaehaera. But there are some names from the Dance of the Dragons that seem to escape this tarring of negativity. Of course, both Aegon and Viserys remained popular names, very much due to the outcome of the war, but some names became more popular post-war than they ever were prior. We have Daeron, used 3 times after the dance, despite the involvement of Prince Daeron Targaryen for the Greens in the Reach. 2 popular kings are even called Daeron, the eldest son of King Aegon III and the eldest son of King Aegon IV. The eldest son of King Maegor Targaryen was also a Prince Daeron. Now, from the limited historical accounts we have access to, it does seem that most regarded Daeron of the Dance highly, and he has gone down in legend as this young, fearless, reasonable prince, conducting himself in a more honourable way than most during the war. When all this is considered, it might explain why he could have become this popular cult hero figure, gaining the name Daeron the Daring post-dance, with him being remembered more fondly than the likes of Aemond and Daemon, for example. Speaking of Daemon, given his role in the build-up and during the dance, it makes sense why his name never really caught on. It seems that he was the first Targaryen to be named Daemon, with the closest name to it being a Daemon Targaryen prior to the conquest. There might also be a second reason. It may not actually be a Targaryen name in the first place, like Alysanne and Jaehaerys. It could in fact come from House Velaryon. While there has never been a Daemon Targaryen prior to him, there have been several Daemon Velaryons in the years just prior and just after Aegon's conquest. If you also take a look at the common Valyrian names, there are several that might be linked to the name Daemon. While there was never another Daemon Targaryen, we should of course mention Daemon Blackfyre, the bastard son of King Aegon IV and his cousin Rhaena Targaryen. We know it was Rhaena who named her son, and that Rhaena herself was quite a rebellious woman. Naming her son after his rogue great-grandfather fits her character well. Via Daemon Blackfyre, the name Daemon took on a new life thanks to the Blackfyre rebellions, with several of Daemon Blackfyre's descendants being called Daemon. The name Daemon became for House Blackfyre what the name Aegon is to House Targaryen. I think the popular and common Targaryen names are popular for a reason, and it makes sense why they would be chosen by a parent. But there are also dozens of one-off and rare Targaryen names that really do leave you scratching your head as to why they never gained popularity. Names that came without the baggage of the Civil War or a tyrant king. But one misconception I do think gets greatly overlooked when talking about this subject is the fact Valyrian families seem to have this very different naming convention than most other Westerosi houses, even when compared to real-world historical examples. They very commonly, when naming a child after someone else, will not directly use that name, but a variation on it. So Rhaenys, Rhaena, Rhaella, Rhaenyra. What that does, it makes it look like there are uncommon names that seem like they shouldn't be, until you sit back and consider they're all references to the same person. In this case, they're all variations of the name Rhaenys.